The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty hills surrounding Pusan as Lieutenant Colonel Michael Michaelis wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted through his binoculars at the advancing North Korean column. The sight that greeted him sent a chill down his spine despite the oppressive heat. Thousands of enemy soldiers, their tan uniforms barely visible against the brown landscape, were moving like a relentless tide toward the final stronghold of the United Nations forces in Korea. It was August 4, 1950, and the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance. The Korean War had begun just 6 weeks earlier when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, launching a massive invasion that caught the world by surprise. Now, after a series of devastating defeats and retreats, the remnants of the South Korean army and their American allies found themselves compressed into a desperate perimeter around the vital port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. General Walton Harris Walker, commander of the United States 8th Army, stood in his makeshift command post in Taegu, studying the tactical maps that told a story of unrelenting disaster. The gruff, stocky Texan had earned his nickname Bulldog during World War II, but even his legendary tenacity was being tested by the seemingly impossible situation. The Battle of the Pusan perimeter would last from August 4 to September 18, 1950, and Walker knew that every day, every hour, perhaps every minute could determine whether the United Nations forces would maintain their foothold in Asia or be driven into the sea. The perimeter itself was a roughly rectangular defensive line stretching approximately 140 miles around the port of Pusan. To the west, the mighty Naktong River served as a natural barrier, while the Taebaek Mountains provided some protection to the north and east. Yet despite these geographical advantages, the defenders were vastly outnumbered and running desperately short of ammunition, supplies, and most critically, experienced combat troops. Walker had made his intentions crystal clear to his subordinate commanders just days earlier. In what would become one of the most famous speeches of the Korean War, he declared that there would be no more retreating, no more falling back. Every man would fight where he stood, and if necessary, die where he stood. The message was simple but profound. This was their Alamo, their Thermopylae, their final stand against overwhelming odds. The North Korean People's Army, emboldened by their string of victories, pressed their advantage with characteristic ruthlessness. Their commander, Marshal Cho Yong-gon, had assured his political masters in Pyongyang that the Americans would be driven from Korean soil within weeks. The Communist forces had already captured Seoul, the South Korean capital, and most of the peninsula. Victory seemed within their grasp, requiring only one final push to eliminate the last pocket of resistance. As the sun began to set on that fateful August evening, Walker made his way to the front lines to personally assess the situation. The sounds of distant artillery echoed across the hills, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the humid air. Young American soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, crouched in hastily dug foxholes, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. These were not the seasoned veterans who had fought in the Pacific during World War II, but occupation troops who had been living comfortable lives in Japan just weeks before. The stakes extended far beyond the Korean peninsula itself. President Harry Truman and his advisors in Washington understood that this battle would determine whether the United States could credibly claim to be the leader of the free world in the emerging Cold War. A defeat here would not only abandon South Korea to communist rule, but would also signal to allies around the globe that American security guarantees were worthless. The domino theory suggested that if Korea fell, Japan, Southeast Asia, and perhaps even Western Europe might follow. Walker's radio crackled to life with reports from sector commanders along the perimeter. The North Koreans were probing for weaknesses, testing the defenses with small-scale attacks and reconnaissance in force. Intelligence reports suggested that a major offensive was imminent, potentially within the next 48 hours. The general closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that the decisions he made in the coming days would echo through history. The Battle of the Pusan perimeter was about to begin in earnest. The attack came at dawn on August 6, 1950, with the fury of a summer thunderstorm. The earth trembled under the impact of North Korean artillery as shells screamed overhead and exploded among the defensive positions. In the gray pre-dawn light, American sentries peered through the smoke and dust to see a sight that would haunt their dreams for decades to come. Thousands upon thousands of North Korean soldiers advancing across the rice paddies and hills in human wave attacks that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. On the night of August 5 through 6, 1950, the North Korean 4th Division crossed the Naktong River on the western edge of the Pusan perimeter, beginning what would become known as the First Battle of the Naktong Bulge. The crossing point had been carefully selected by North Korean commanders who had spent weeks studying American defensive patterns and identifying the weakest sections of the perimeter. Under cover of darkness, advance units had managed to establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the river, creating a dangerous bulge in the United Nations lines. Sergeant First Class William Richardson of the 2nd Infantry Division was among the first to sound the alarm. From his observation post overlooking the river valley, he watched in horror as enemy engineers worked frantically to construct pontoon bridges while waves of infantry prepared to exploit the breakthrough. His urgent radio calls brought immediate responses from artillery units and air support, but the sheer scale of the North Korean assault threatened to overwhelm the defenders through pure weight of numbers. The communist strategy was as brutal as it was effective. Drawing on tactics developed during the Chinese Civil War, North Korean commanders hurled masses of infantry against specific points in the defensive line, accepting enormous casualties in exchange for the possibility of achieving a decisive breakthrough. The psychological impact on the defenders was almost as devastating as the physical assault. American and South Korean soldiers found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to value human life so little that death held no terror for them. This information is referenced from military archives and historical accounts of the Korean War as documented by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Captain James Mitchell of the 1st Cavalry Division later described the scene as resembling something from the medieval era rather than modern warfare. Bugles blared across the battlefield as North Korean officers led their men forward with swords drawn, shouting revolutionary slogans and communist battle cries. The attackers came in waves, with each successive assault stepping over the bodies of those who had fallen before them. The defense of Hill 203 became legendary among the survivors of the battle. 2nd Lieutenant Robert Sterling and his platoon of 32 men found themselves surrounded by enemy forces but refused to abandon their position. For 6 hours, they held their ground against repeated assaults, calling in artillery strikes on their own position when the enemy came within hand-to-hand combat range. When relief forces finally reached them, only 7 members of the platoon remained alive, but they had inflicted casualties on the enemy far out of proportion to their numbers. General Walker himself came under direct fire while conducting a personal reconnaissance of the battlefield. His jeep was struck by mortar fragments, and his driver was wounded, but the crusty commander refused to be evacuated. Instead, he established a forward command post just 3 miles behind the front lines, where he could maintain direct communication with his embattled units and make tactical decisions in real time. His presence had an immediate impact on morale, as word spread through the ranks that the old man was sharing their dangers. The North Korean assault was not limited to the Naktong River crossing. Simultaneous attacks were launched against Taegu in the north, Gyeongju in the east, and Masan in the south. The enemy strategy was clearly designed to stretch the United Nations forces to their breaking point by forcing them to defend multiple threatened sectors simultaneously. Each attack was preceded by intensive artillery bombardments that destroyed communications lines and created chaos in the rear areas. Air support proved crucial in blunting the enemy offensive. Marine Corsair fighters and Air Force Mustangs flew close support missions throughout the day, strafing enemy troop concentrations and destroying supply columns. The pilots often flew at dangerously low altitudes, braving intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver napalm and machine gun fire with pinpoint accuracy. Their intervention was particularly effective against the massed infantry formations that represented the core of North Korean tactical doctrine. By the end of the first day, the situation remained desperate but not hopeless. The North Korean 4th Division had succeeded in establishing a significant bridgehead across the Naktong River, and enemy forces were advancing toward the vital road junction at Yongsan. However, the initial human wave attacks had failed to achieve the clean breakthrough that communist commanders had expected. American artillery had taken a terrible toll on the attacking forces, and the defensive positions, though battered, remained largely intact. The stage was set for an even more desperate struggle in the days to come. The stench of death hung heavy over the battlefield as August 7th dawned with another thunderous artillery barrage from North Korean guns. The first battle of the Naktong Bulge had entered its second day, and the communist forces were determined to exploit their hard-won bridgehead before United Nations reinforcements could arrive. Major General Hobart Gay, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, knew that his exhausted troops were approaching their breaking point, but retreat was not an option. Every yard of ground surrendered brought the enemy closer to the vital port of Pusan and potential victory in the war. The tactical situation had deteriorated significantly during the night. North Korean engineers had succeeded in constructing additional bridges across the Naktong River, allowing tanks and heavy equipment to join the assault. The ominous rumble of T-34 tanks could be heard approaching the American lines, their steel tracks grinding against the rocky terrain as they advanced through the morning mist. For many of the young American soldiers, this would be their first encounter with enemy armor, and the psychological impact was profound. Colonel John Michaelis, commanding the 27th Infantry Regiment, received urgent orders to counterattack and restore the original defensive line. His regiment, nicknamed the Wolfhounds, had already suffered heavy casualties in the initial fighting, but they were among the most experienced units available to Walker. Michaelis assembled his remaining company commanders in a bomb crater that served as a makeshift command post, and outlined a plan that would require extraordinary courage and sacrifice from his men. The counterattack began at 0800 hours with a concentrated artillery barrage on known enemy positions. American 105mm howitzers pounded the North Korean bridgehead, while mortar teams provided supporting fire for the advancing infantry. The sound was deafening, a continuous thunder that rolled across the valley and echoed off the surrounding hills. In the distance, the distinctive whine of incoming shells could be heard as North Korean artillery responded with their own devastating fire. Corporal David Washington of the 25th Infantry Division found himself leading a squad of replacements who had arrived from Japan only days earlier. Most of them had never been in combat before, and their faces reflected the terror that gripped every soldier in their first battle. Washington, a veteran of World War II, tried to project confidence he did not feel as he led his men forward through the smoke and chaos. The enemy fire was intense, with machine gun bullets snapping overhead and mortar shells exploding all around their advance. The battle for Hill 117 became a microcosm of the larger struggle. This apparently insignificant piece of high ground controlled the approaches to the river crossing and had changed hands 3 times in the past 24 hours. American forces had originally occupied the hill, been driven off by a North Korean night attack, and now were attempting to retake it through direct assault. The slopes were littered with the bodies of soldiers from both sides, grim testimony to the ferocity of the fighting. As referenced from detailed accounts in the official Army historical records, the close-quarters combat that characterized the Battle of the Pusan perimeter was unlike anything American forces had experienced since the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific War. Enemy soldiers would often fight to the death rather than surrender, and American troops found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, rifle butts, and even entrenching tools. The brutality was shocking to soldiers who had expected a conventional war against a modern army. The medical situation was becoming critical as casualty evacuation helicopters struggled to reach the wounded under intense enemy fire. Captain Mary Rodriguez, an Army nurse stationed at the field hospital in Pusan, worked tirelessly to save the lives of soldiers who arrived with devastating wounds. The hospital was operating beyond capacity, with wounded men lying on stretchers in the corridors and medical supplies running dangerously low. The stream of casualties seemed endless, a constant reminder of the desperate nature of the fighting at the perimeter. Communications between units had been severely disrupted by enemy artillery fire, forcing commanders to rely on runners and visual signals to coordinate their actions. Radio antennas were priority targets for North Korean snipers, and several communications specialists had been killed trying to maintain contact with higher headquarters. The fog of war was particularly thick during these crucial hours, with neither side having a clear picture of the overall tactical situation. By midday, their defensive positions were well-sighted and expertly camouflaged, allowing them to deliver devastating fire on any approaching troops. The attacking Americans found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, pinned down in open terrain with little cover from the scorching sun and enemy bullets. General Walker arrived at the front lines personally to assess the situation and make critical decisions about the deployment of his limited reserves. The sight that greeted him was sobering: exhausted soldiers with 1,000-yard stares, ammunition running low, and enemy forces firmly established in positions that threatened the entire defensive perimeter. The next few hours would determine whether the United Nations forces could maintain their foothold in Korea or would be forced to begin preparations for a humiliating evacuation. The sound of aircraft engines provided the first glimmer of hope as Marine corsairs screamed overhead, their guns blazing as they strafed North Korean positions along the Naktung River. It was the afternoon of August 8, 1950, and the tide of battle was about to turn through the extraordinary heroism of individual soldiers and the devastating effectiveness of American air power. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, watched as napalm canisters tumbled from the wings of the attacking aircraft and exploded in brilliant orange fireballs that illuminated the battlefield like scenes from hell itself. The close air support mission had been coordinated by 1st Lieutenant James Patterson, a forward air controller who had been calling in strikes from an exposed position on Hill 255 for the past 6 hours. Despite being wounded by shrapnel from a mortar burst, Patterson continued to direct aircraft onto enemy targets with deadly precision. His calm voice on the radio, describing target locations and adjusting fire, became a lifeline for the beleaguered infantry units struggling to hold their positions against overwhelming odds. In the town of Yongsan, a critical road junction that controlled access to Pusan, Sergeant Major Robert Johnson and a mixed force of American and South Korean soldiers were fighting a desperate house-to-house battle against North Korean infiltrators. The communist forces had managed to penetrate the town during the night, and now every building potentially contained enemy soldiers. Johnson, a towering African-American soldier from Georgia, had volunteered to lead a clearing operation that would take his small force through the most dangerous sections of the town. The racial integration of American forces in Korea was still a controversial and incomplete process, But the exigencies of combat had a way of breaking down barriers that peacetime policies could not. Johnson found himself commanding white soldiers who had initially viewed him with suspicion but now followed his orders without question. His tactical expertise and personal courage had earned their respect in the most fundamental way possible. He had kept them alive in situations where survival seemed impossible. The heroism displayed during these critical hours was not limited to professional soldiers. Chaplain Émile Capon, a Catholic priest serving with the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, had become legendary among the troops for his fearless ministry under fire. When the battalion aid station was overrun by North Korean forces, Capon personally carried wounded soldiers to safety while enemy bullets whistled around him. His black cassock, torn and bloodstained, became a symbol of hope for soldiers who had begun to doubt whether they would ever see home again. Artillery played a crucial role in stemming the North Korean advance, but the gun crews were operating under extremely difficult conditions. Battery A of the 13th Field Artillery Battalion found themselves firing over open sights at enemy tanks that had broken through the forward defensive positions. Captain William Henderson, the battery commander, personally aimed one of the howitzers and scored a direct hit on a T-34 tank at a range of less than 800 yards. The exploding tank created a spectacular fireball that lit up the evening sky and marked the beginning of a successful defense of the artillery positions. As documented in contemporary war correspondence reports from the battlefield, the individual acts of heroism that characterized the Battle of the Pusan perimeter were often spontaneous responses to desperate situations rather than planned operations. Private First Class Stanley Williams, a 19-year-old machine gunner from Ohio, single-handedly held off an entire North Korean company when his position was overrun. Armed only with his M1919 Browning automatic rifle and a handful of grenades, Williams fought from a shell crater for 3 hours until relief forces could reach him. When found, he was unconscious from loss of blood but still gripping his weapon. The medical personnel serving at the perimeter demonstrated courage equal to that of the combat soldiers they treated. Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of the few female physicians serving with the Army in Korea, performed emergency surgery in a tent hospital while North Korean artillery shells exploded nearby. The constant threat of enemy fire made normal medical procedures impossible, but Martinez and her team saved hundreds of lives through their skill and dedication. Many of the wounded soldiers she treated would later credit her with giving them the will to survive. The North Korean forces were also fighting with desperate courage, knowing that failure to break through the perimeter would likely result in a prolonged war of attrition that they could not win. Communist political officers moved among the attacking troops, exhorting them to greater efforts and executing any soldiers who showed signs of wavering. The fanatical determination of the enemy forces was both frightening and impressive to the American defenders, who had to admire their opponents' willingness to sacrifice everything for their cause. Night fighting became a particular specialty of both sides as commanders sought to exploit the cover of darkness to achieve tactical advantages. American forces had superior night vision equipment and better training in nocturnal operations, but the North Koreans compensated through superior knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to accept casualties that would be unacceptable to Western armies. The result was a series of vicious small-unit actions that continued throughout the hours of darkness, with positions changing hands multiple times before dawn. By the morning of August 9th, the immediate crisis had passed, but both sides were exhausted and bloodied by the intensity of the fighting. The North Korean bridgehead across the Naktung River remained intact, but their advance had been stopped short of the critical objectives. American forces had demonstrated that they could fight effectively against a determined enemy, but the cost in human lives had been staggering. The battle was far from over, and even greater challenges lay ahead. The morning mist clung to the Naktung River Valley like a shroud as General Walker stood atop Hill 308, surveying the battlefield that had become the anvil upon which American resolve was being hammered into steel. It was August 15, 1950, and the Battle of the Pusan perimeter had entered its 3rd week with no clear resolution in sight. The North Korean offensive had been contained, but not defeated, and Walker knew that his forces were walking a tightrope between victory and catastrophe with each passing day. Intelligence reports indicated that the Communist High Command was preparing for one final, massive assault that would either break the United Nations lines or exhaust their remaining reserves in the attempt. Prisoners captured during recent fighting spoke of reinforcements arriving from North Korea and China, including veteran units that had fought in the Chinese Civil War. The prospect of facing battle-hardened troops who had already defeated one of the world's largest armies was sobering for American commanders who were struggling to maintain their positions with increasingly inexperienced replacement troops. The logistical situation had become a nightmare of epic proportions. Every round of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every medical supply had to be shipped across thousands of miles of ocean and then transported to the front lines under constant threat of enemy interdiction. The port of Pusan itself was under regular artillery bombardment, forcing supply ships to unload their cargoes under extremely hazardous conditions. Stevedores and dock workers performed their duties with the same courage as frontline soldiers, knowing that a single enemy shell could destroy weeks of accumulated supplies. Colonel Paul Freeman, commanding the 23rd Infantry Regiment, had been given the task of organizing the defense of the Taegu sector, where intelligence suggested the next major enemy offensive would fall. Freeman, a thoughtful officer who had studied military history extensively, recognized that he was facing a situation similar to those encountered by commanders throughout history who had been forced to hold key terrain against superior numbers. His regiment was under strength and equipped with weapons that were often inferior to those of the enemy, but they possessed advantages in training, leadership, and morale that could not be quantified on paper. The human cost of the prolonged battle was becoming increasingly apparent in the field hospitals and evacuation centers scattered throughout the perimeter. Major Patricia O'Brien, chief nurse at the 8th Army Surgical Hospital, had seen more traumatic injuries in the past 2 weeks than in her entire previous career. The young men arriving on stretchers bore wounds that would have been fatal in previous wars, but advances in medical technology and battlefield medicine were saving lives that would have been lost just 5 years earlier. The psychological wounds were often more difficult to treat than the physical ones, as soldiers struggled to cope with the intensity and duration of the combat. Air power continued to be the great equalizer in the unequal struggle. The 5th Air Force, commanded by General Earl Partridge, had established air superiority over the battlefield and was using it to devastating effect against North Korean supply lines and troop concentrations. B-29 superfortresses flew daily missions against enemy airfields and industrial targets, while fighter bombers provided close support to ground forces engaged in desperate battles along the perimeter. The psychological impact of constant air attacks was beginning to show in the declining morale of enemy forces, as evidenced by increased desertion rates and reduced combat effectiveness. The international dimension of the conflict was becoming increasingly important as forces from other United Nations member countries began to arrive in Korea. The British 27th Infantry Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Basil Code, had just completed their deployment to the Pusan area and were preparing to enter combat alongside their American allies. The arrival of experienced British troops, many of whom were World War II veterans, provided a significant boost to morale and combat capability. Similar contingents from Turkey, Thailand, and the Philippines were en route, transforming what had begun as primarily an American operation into a truly international effort. As documented in military intelligence reports from the period, North Korean forces were beginning to show signs of strain after weeks of intensive combat and heavy casualties. Captured documents revealed serious supply shortages, particularly in ammunition and medical supplies, and interrogation of prisoners indicated declining morale in some enemy units. However, communist commanders were compensating for these weaknesses by increasing political indoctrination and imposing harsh discipline on their troops. Summary executions of soldiers accused of cowardice or defeatism were reportedly common, creating a climate of terror that motivated troops through fear rather than patriotism. The defense of the Bowling Alley, a narrow valley north of Taegu that became one of the most contested pieces of terrain in the entire battle, illustrated the savage nature of the fighting that characterized this phase of the conflict. The valley earned its nickname from the way North Korean tank shells ricocheted off its rocky walls, creating a sound reminiscent of bowling balls striking pins. American troops defending the valley faced nightly attacks by enemy armor and infantry, fighting battles that often lasted until dawn before the North Koreans withdrew to regroup for the next assault. Technological innovations born of necessity were changing the nature of warfare in ways that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The extensive use of helicopters for medical evacuation and supply missions was pioneering techniques that would become standard practice in future conflicts. Forward air controllers working directly with ground units were developing close air support procedures that maximized the effectiveness of tactical aviation. Even simple innovations like improved field telephone systems and portable radio equipment were making significant differences in command and control capabilities. The resilience of the South Korean Army, which had been written off as ineffective after the initial North Korean invasion, was beginning to emerge as a significant factor in the defense of the perimeter. ROK units that had been rebuilt and re-equipped with American weapons were proving capable of holding their assigned sectors against determined enemy attacks. The transformation of the South Korean military from a demoralized and defeated force into an effective fighting organization was one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire campaign. As August drew to a close, both sides were preparing for what many observers believed would be the decisive phase of the battle. The North Koreans were massing their remaining reserves for one final offensive that would either achieve victory or exhaust their capacity for further major operations. The United Nations forces, though battered and bloodied, had demonstrated their ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation that would determine the fate of Korea and possibly the entire course of the Cold War. Dawn broke on September 15, 1950, with a thunderous roar of naval gunfire as the USS Missouri and her sister ships opened fire on North Korean positions near Incheon, 200 miles behind enemy lines. The sound of those 16-inch guns marked the beginning of Operation Chromite, General Douglas MacArthur's audacious amphibious landing that would transform the strategic situation in Korea and ultimately break the siege of the Pusan perimeter. For the exhausted defenders who had held their positions for 6 grueling weeks, the distant thunder represented the first tangible hope of victory they had experienced since the battle began. General Walker received the coded message announcing the successful Incheon landings at his command post in Taegu, and for the first time in weeks, a smile crossed his weathered face. The timing could not have been more perfect. North Korean forces had launched their final offensive against the perimeter just 3 days earlier, throwing their last reserves into a desperate attempt to break through before American reinforcements could arrive. The communist commanders had unknowingly committed their forces to a battle they could no longer win, leaving their rear areas virtually undefended against MacArthur's surprise attack. The tactical situation along the perimeter began to change dramatically as reports filtered in from the front lines. North Korean units that had been attacking with fanatical determination suddenly began to waver as word spread of the American landings in their rear. Radio intercepts revealed growing confusion in enemy command centers as communist leaders struggled to understand the full implications of the Incheon operation. The psychological impact of the landings was immediate and profound, shattering the morale of North Korean forces who had believed they were on the verge of final victory. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Murch, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, was among the first to notice the change in enemy behavior. North Korean forces that had been pressing their attacks with suicidal determination began to show signs of hesitation and uncertainty. Probing attacks that would normally have been followed by massive assaults were instead broken off after brief contact. Enemy artillery fire, which had been constant and accurate for weeks, became sporadic and poorly directed. The change was subtle but unmistakable to experienced commanders who had been fighting the same enemy for months. The logistical nightmare that had plagued United Nations forces throughout the battle began to ease as supply lines from Japan were reinforced and enemy interdiction efforts diminished. The port of Pusan, which had been operating under constant threat of enemy bombardment, could now function more efficiently as North Korean artillery was withdrawn to deal with the threat to their rear areas. Fresh ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements began arriving in quantities that had been impossible to maintain during the darkest days of the siege. Captain Jennifer Morrison, an intelligence officer with the 2nd Infantry Division, was tasked with analyzing captured enemy documents that revealed the full extent of North Korean plans for the final offensive against the perimeter. The documents showed that communist commanders had intended to launch coordinated attacks against all sectors of the defensive line simultaneously, using their last reserves of men and material in a desperate gamble for victory. The failure of this offensive, combined with the threat posed by the Incheon landings, left North Korean forces in an impossible strategic position. The breakout from the Pusan perimeter began on September 16 with a massive artillery bombardment that dwarfed anything the defenders had been able to mount during the siege. Guns that had been conserving ammunition for weeks unleashed a devastating barrage that shattered North Korean defensive positions and demoralized enemy troops who had not experienced such intensive fire since the early days of the war. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction, demonstrating to friend and foe alike that the balance of power had shifted decisively. Air support reached unprecedented levels of intensity as the 5th Air Force committed every available aircraft to supporting the ground offensive. B-26 Invaders and F-80 Shooting Stars flew continuous missions against enemy positions, supply lines, and retreating columns. The North Korean Air Force, which had been virtually eliminated during the early weeks of the war, was unable to provide any meaningful opposition to the massive air armada. The skies above Korea belonged entirely to the United Nations forces, and they used that advantage to devastating effect. As chronicled in battlefield reports from war correspondents covering the breakout, the transformation of United Nations forces from desperate defenders to confident attackers was remarkable to witness. Soldiers who had spent weeks crouched in foxholes, conserving ammunition and praying for survival, suddenly found themselves advancing across terrain they had been defending just days earlier. The psychological impact of going on the offensive after such a prolonged defensive battle created a sense of momentum that proved impossible for the enemy to stop. The retreat of North Korean forces quickly degenerated into a rout as unit cohesion broke down under the pressure of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Communist commanders had no contingency plans for dealing with a major amphibious landing in their rear while simultaneously conducting offensive operations against the Pusan perimeter. The result was chaos in the enemy command structure and the collapse of organized resistance across much of the Korean peninsula. General Walker's forces advanced rapidly northward, liberated Seoul on September 28, and established contact with MacArthur's 10th Corps near Suwon. The link-up marked the end of the Battle of the Pusan perimeter and the beginning of a new phase in the Korean War. The North Korean People's Army, which had seemed invincible just weeks earlier, was now in full retreat toward the 38th parallel and beyond. The human cost of the Battle of the Pusan perimeter was staggering. American casualties exceeded 15,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while South Korean losses were even higher. North Korean casualties were estimated at over 50,000, representing a significant portion of their original invasion force. The battle had been a crucible that tested the resolve of democratic nations against totalitarian aggression, and the outcome would influence the course of the Cold War for decades to come. The strategic implications of the successful defense extended far beyond the Korean peninsula. The demonstration that American forces could stand and fight against a determined communist enemy provided crucial reassurance to allies around the world who were facing similar threats. The Battle of the Pusan perimeter proved that the United States had the will and capability to honor its commitments, even when the cost was high and the outcome uncertain. The tide had indeed turned, and the free world had found its footing in the long struggle that lay ahead.